Okay, welcome back everybody. I'm Mark Davis here at St. Mark Presbyterian Church, and we're continuing our study through this season of Lent, following our theme between our rock and hard places. We are in the 5th week of Lent at this time, and you can see that we continue to stay in the Gospel of John. We'll be here one more week here, and then we'll switch back to Mark for Palm Sunday and Passion Sunday. But we are fast forwarding a bit. We went from chapter 2 to 3, and now we're all the way in chapter 12. Now, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us here at St. Mark. I typically send a handout along with the link to this video to those who ask for it. And if you're watching by some other means and you'd like to see the handout, I do think you will find it helpful. And just contact us at either of these means, and we will send that to you. So we're going to look at today's text in respect to 4 different pieces. The first is something of an introduction, but a curious one. And the last 3 have some relationship to the time, the hour at hand. And that's how we're going to break it down. I don't know if that's the best way to do it. That's the way that seems to work best for me. So we're going to start with verses 20, 21, and 22. Now, among those who went up to worship at the festival were some Greeks. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and said to him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Philip went and told Andrew, and Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. Okay, so this first couple of verses, there's a request and there's a reaction. The request comes from the Greeks, the reaction comes from Philip, then Andrew, and they bring it to Jesus. In the Gospels, generally people who are not Jewish are called Gentiles. Sometimes people who are not Jewish are called Greeks, so they may or may not actually be from Greece. During the Greek Empire, just that a lot of people kind of took on the connotation of being Greek if they were part of that kind of imperial influx of outsiders, as it were. In the book of Acts, there's a lot of discussion about people who are believers, perhaps even attenders of the synagogues, but are not necessarily Jewish, either Galilean or Judean. And Luke has a couple of different terms for those folks. It's not always been terribly clear what exactly he means by it. One of them is typically translated God-fearers, because the word phobos is in the title, which means to fear. And the other is a very different word that means something like devout or prayerful or something like that. Some biblical scholars feel like these are basically Lucan terms that he constructed himself. But remember, on the day of Pentecost, the book of Acts chapter 2 describes all the people who are there and all the nations or countries and languages areas from which they come. There's a lot of discussion of whether they are Jews who are living in foreign countries as a result of various diaspora, or perhaps just by choice. I'm not so sure that the language necessarily indicates that they're necessarily Jewish. But there sure are a lot of nations represented for the Festival of Weeks, which is called Pentecost. So it's not unusual then that as the festival of Passover is taking place in our text, that there are some folks there who are not Judean, not Galilean, maybe not even Jewish whatsoever, and you have these Greeks who ask to see Jesus. And when they do, we get a kind of curious game of telephone, don't we? Greeks ask Andrew, Andrew asks, Greeks go to Philip, Philip goes to Andrew, Andrew and Philip go to Jesus. I don't know why. Philip didn't just go directly to Jesus. I don't know why the Greeks came to Philip. I had assumed all along that perhaps Bethsaida was one of those coastal cities. It's on the Sea of Galilee, the northern portion, somewhere up there. thought maybe by virtue of being on the coast there, maybe near the Jordan River, it might be a trade route, and so maybe a more cosmopolitan area. I did some reading this week, and it seems like a lot of biblical archaeologists don't really feel confident about where exactly Bethsaida was. One location that a lot of archaeologists favor seems too distant from the Sea of Galilee and to have been a coastal town, even if the sea were a little different back in the earlier days. So it's just kind of hard to say why the Greeks would go to Philip. I mean, maybe he was just nice. Maybe he was the first person they saw of the 12. But for some reason they go to Philip. And the fact that it's Philip, not Simon Peter or James or John, as the three who are so prominent in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is curious. And the fact that Philip goes to Andrew, not Andrew's brother Simon Peter, also is kind of curious. But they take it to Jesus, and you know what's interesting is Jesus doesn't ever really address the Greeks in this story. I mean, this is the request. It sets up what follows. It's almost as if the Greeks are simply left out of the story after this. So here's an interpretive question for us. I'm never of the opinion that biblical writers will write something and then just leave it as if it's not very important. I think the exercise, the cost, the work of writing was a little too hard for someone just to write flippant stuff that they didn't intend to follow up on. So the question is, even though the Greeks are not mentioned anymore after these verses we just read, and even though Jesus does not actually come into conversation with them directly, is this a throwaway introduction, or does it somehow mean something to the rest of the text? I think that's an important question and something I want to mull about with you a little bit on Wednesday, if you can join our discussion. Why does it matter that Greeks came to see Jesus and that Jesus now launches into a conversation that seems totally disconnected to their request? So let's move on then to the next part, which are verses 23 through 26. I'll call this this section, the hour and the wheat. Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Those who love their life lose it. Those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honor." Okay, that's a lot. And in fact, I think this holds the kernel, as it were, to the whole text that we're reading this week. We call it the hour and the wheat because it began with the phrase, "The hour has come." The term, the hour, is real important in John's Gospel. And if you want to visit my blog, it's called Left Behind and Loving It. You can just put that in your search engine, and almost assuredly my blog will come up as one of the first possibilities. This week's edition of the blog is a translation and way too many comments about our text. And under verse 25, I think it is, I have a list. No, verse 23. I have a list of the number of times that this phrase, "the hour," shows up in John's Gospel, and a number of times that the phrase "glorified" shows up in John's Gospel. These are very, very important words in the Gospel of John. So for sure on Wednesday we'll need to take a moment to walk through some of those texts and just see how important this phrase, the hour. Just as a teaser, you might remember that the first story of Jesus' signs is when he turned the water into wine at the wedding in Cana. And that story begins by saying that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there, and turns out Jesus and some of his friends were there. And when the wine had run out, Mary went to Jesus and said, "They have no wine." It's just a great little story. And but Jesus' response to her sounds kind of harsh. He says, "Woman, what has that to do with me? My hour has not yet come." So back in chapter 2, Jesus seemed a little reluctant to do what he ultimately did, which is to change water into wine. And the reluctance is expressed that his hour has not yet come. So this hour signifies something real important. I want to make you aware of a distinction that a theologian named Paul Tillich once made, which I think is just profound. It's not a technical distinction that works every single time in the New Testament, but Paul Tillich pointed out that there are two different Greek words for time. One is chronos, and we still use that in many of our English words, chronological, chronology, and so forth. Chronos, based on the god Chronos, the god of time. So you have chronos, which refers to linear time. And then you have kairos. That's another word. It would be spelled like Kairos, kairos. Another word for time that sometimes can refer to linear time also, but not always. In fact, very often instead of linear time, it refers to the right time. The right time. One of the instances in the word "the hour" that is on my blog is a reference to a woman in labor because her hour has come. And of course that doesn't mean, it's 3 o'clock. It means that something's ready to happen. The moment is there. So think about that when you see that phrase, "the hour has come." It's not so much that there's a timeline and it has to be precisely on that, but things are ready to happen. Birth is ready to happen. Grain is ready to spring into new life. Those kinds of things. And then again, Jesus uses the phrase, "the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." Glorified. That word just appears over and over in John's Gospel, often, but not exclusively, referring to Jesus' death. The time has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. It could also refer to the whole drama around the death. In chapter 13 perhaps, at the Last Supper, when Judas has left the building to go and betray Jesus, Jesus says, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified." So even betrayal, not necessarily physical death, but even betrayal of Jesus is the fulfillment of this word "glorify." And we're going to see it several more times in our text, but again, in my blog, I have a list of all the times it appears in John's Gospel, and it's an incredibly important term for the way John tells the story. And then Jesus offers a metaphor that I think is probably the key to this whole text that we're reading and to much of what we read in John's Gospel. Jesus says, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it just remains a single grain. But if it dies," Jesus said, not if it's planted, but if it dies, then it will bear much fruit. So think about that. Think about that, because in the Gospels, we get we get a lot of phrases about discipleship, such as, those who lose their life will save it. Or, those who want to become great must become servant of all. Both of those ideas are going to appear later in our text. And we generally refer to those phrases as a paradox, right? You lose your life in order to save it. But those who seek to save their life will lose it. We heard that last week in our chapter 3. We're going to hear it again today. We call it a paradox, but actually it's based on this metaphor of what happens in nature. It happens all the time. Everything that grows from the ground is a seed that has died and lost itself in order that it could fruit into something new and greater than itself. That's a real key for understanding how Jesus sees his death and how he sees discipleship. So immediately after giving us that key metaphor, then Jesus starts to talk about how you have to either love your life or your psyche. That's the Greek term there that we use for psychology and so forth. You either love that and thereby lose your life, or you hate it and thereby gain new life. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, just think, if a grain of wheat loves itself as a grain of wheat and refuses to let go, it's just going to remain a grain of wheat. But if it lets go of who it is as a grain of wheat and dies to that, then it bears fruit. This call to discipleship, this paradox of discipleship, the language is rough because it uses love and hate and so forth. We can look at those terms a little more closely on Wednesday. But the whole idea is, are you going to hang on to the particular form of life that you had to this point, or are you willing to let go of that in order for new life to emerge? That's an interesting, it's not just a paradox of discipleship, it's a paradox that's grounded, if you will, in what happens in nature. And I keep looking over there because right outside that window is the canyon here at St. Mark, and everything growing there has grown because some grain or seed or something like that, a spore, has died to its previous condition and has sprung into a new way of being. This is the heart of our text today, and probably of much of John's gospel, certainly John's interpretation of the cross. So let's move to the next part 3. Jesus says, this starts out very somberly, doesn't it? Now my soul is troubled. And what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The crowd standing there heard it and said that it was thunder. Others said, an angel has spoken to him. Jesus answered, this voice has come for your sake, not for mine. There's a lot of curious stuff in there, and I am not going to satisfy many of your questions, I'm afraid. But in this section, it's all about the hour and the glory. It's incredible that it begins with the phrase, my soul is troubled. In the 13th chapter, which again is the Last Supper, only instead of bread and wine, it's all about washing feet before they eat together. Jesus says at that table, the narrator says, after saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. You know, there are a lot of folks who read the Gospel of John. It's very mystical in some respects, and in some respects Jesus seems to know what's getting ready to happen before it happens, and doesn't seem to necessarily be on a learning curve, as it were. So we get the impression sometimes that the Jesus in John's gospel is just kind of floating a couple inches above the surface, rather than walking this rugged road with the rest of us. But I think words like this in our text here in chapter 12 and in the supper description in chapter 13 shows something very different. Jesus not necessarily above it all. He can be quite troubled in his own spirit. And at the supper, then it becomes real important that in chapter 15, toward the end of the supper together, Jesus looks at the disciples and says, "Don't let your hearts be troubled." It's someone who's bearing that trouble and sorrow so that we don't need to. It's really powerful. But that's how this section we just read started. My soul is troubled. And then Jesus asked a question. What should I ask? Save me from this hour? That would be like a grain of wheat remaining as a grain. Right? That's what that question would be. If Jesus just asked God, save me from this hour, I don't want to do it. It would be the grain of wheat choosing to remain a single grain. And Jesus says, no, glorify your name. That's what he'll pray. So he shows us how not to pray, or how he won't pray, and how he will pray. He won't pray to avoid all of this, as troubling as it is. But he will pray for God to be glorified. So while glorify, the word is often associated with Jesus' death, it's not the death itself that is the end goal here. It's that fruit grows out of that through which God is glorified. It's a real wonderful conclusion, not simply a morbid one of the cross. But this grain of wheat has to go through the death before it can be part of the fruiting. So what not to pray? Save me. Save me. That's not what we pray. What we pray is glorify your name. And in that, Jesus is accepting his place as a grain of wheat. And then we have, it goes a little weird at this point, right? We have a voice from heaven that says, I have glorified it and will glorify it. So glorifying doesn't simply point to Jesus' death on the cross. There are other ways in which God's name is glorified. It has happened and it will happen. And that's the voice from the heavens. So just remember that in John's gospel, you don't have at Jesus' baptism a voice from the heavens saying, you're my son, the beloved. And we don't even have a transfiguration story where the voice from the heavens said, this is my beloved, listen to him. But we do have this. And we have this moment when the voice comes from the heavens, says, I have glorified it, will glorify it. And then the curious thing is those who hear it just don't know what to make of it. Some say it's thunder, some say he's talking to angels. I don't altogether know what that voice from the heavens and unclarity is about, especially because Jesus says, this voice didn't come for my behalf, but for your behalf. Because they're the ones who, some of them think it's thunder. So that's a real curious moment in this story, and I'm not going to pretend that I've got any great insight to it. I'm rather puzzled by how that fits into the story, unless John has some sense that the crowd just isn't getting it, and maybe that's the case. So let's look at the fourth and final part. Then these last three verses. This is curious. What I would invite you to do is, when you read these verses, then go back to last week's text and start with verse 14 and read through at least verse 18, if not the whole thing, and look at the parallels between this thinking and that thinking. Jesus says, now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. And then the narrator says, he said this to indicate the kind of death he was to die. You're going to see the narration say something almost very similar to that at the end of John's Gospel in the 21st chapter, which I think is an addendum. Jesus says something to Simon Peter about how when he is old, he won't be able to lead himself around. He'll be led, and it's a curious reference, but the narrator says, he said this to indicate the kind of death that Peter would die. So this is an interesting narrative comment here. So what do we have? We have the word now, which I think is closely related to the hour, a reference to time, and a kairos sort of time, the right time. Now is the judgment. This whole sentence in verse 31, every verb and every participle in that verse is in the present tense. Now is the judgment. And then in the next phrase, however, now the ruler of the world will be driven out. That's very interesting, isn't it? So let's, that phrase, the ruler of the world, we're going to see it a couple more times. Jesus will say it again at the Last Supper. He says to the disciples, I will no longer talk with you, for the ruler of this world is coming. And then later in that same conversation, Jesus says that he's going to send the Spirit, the Comforter. The Greek word is the Paraclete, the one who abides by them. Jesus says he will prove the world wrong about sin and righteousness and judgment. About sin because they don't believe in me. About righteousness because I'm going to the Father and you will see me no longer. About judgment because the ruler of this world has been condemned. So here we have the ruler of this world will be driven out, cast out, thrown out. In chapter 16, the ruler of this world has been condemned, has been judged, more or less. We'll have to leave it there for now. We'll try to pick up on Wednesday what this whole ruler of the world is. If you want to think in terms of Satan, I suppose you can. I think if John wanted us to just do that, he would have used the phrase Satan. Do we want to think in terms of the Roman emperor? Because it was by the authority of the Empire of Rome that Jesus was put to death. Do we want to think in larger terms of evil powers and principalities that seem to rule who we are? I think John's Gospel leaves it very nebulous for us, and between now and Wednesday I'm going to consult a couple of resources to see if they can offer any insight into who this ruler of the world is, and what being cast out or being condemned really signifies. But that's where we're going to leave it for now. Final word, I just want you to go back to that metaphor of the grain of wheat that has to die in order to bear fruit. Think of the word glorify as Jesus' death in order to draw others to God, to this way of living in the reign of God. Think about that metaphor as a way of hearing those paradoxical statements. You must hate your life in order to gain it. Lose your life in order to gain it. Serve in order to lead. I really feel like that metaphor is a golden one for us, not only in understanding the Gospel of John, but in our own discipleship. So we will leave it there. If you have questions, give us a call. Other than that, I hope to see a number of you on Wednesday. Thanks and bye.